morning, Excellencies, distinguished speakers. His Excellency, Mr. Sean Fraser, Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, Chair of MIRPS Support Platform. Ms. Katrina Tepley, Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, Chair of MIRPS Support Platform. Her Excellency, Ms. Nelly Jerez, Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs of Honduras, MIRPS Pro Tempore Presidency for 2020. Ms. Gillian Trex, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR as part of MIRPS Technical Secretariat. Ms. Mari Carmen Plata, Secretary for Access to Rights and Equity, Organization of American States, also part of the MIRPS Technical Secretariat. Distinguished guests, I wish to thank Canada as a current chair of the Comprehensive Regional Protection and Solutions Framework Support Platform for organizing this high-level event on the protection and empowerment of displaced women and girls from Central America and Mexico, using the MIRPS framework to protect, assist, and empower. My name is Norma Bastidas, and it is an honor for me to moderate this event. Since Canada assumed the role as the support platform chair in July this year, it established a topic of protection and empowerment of women and girls on the move as a chair theme. With this event, the platform joins the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence to draw attention to the international protection needs and the importance of empowering refugees, women and girls in the region, as well as the needs to protect the human rights of migrant women, girls, and LGBTIQ+ individuals in vulnerable situations. To start our event, we will watch a video about the work of the MIRPS, the regional framework that gathers us here today. And we start with the first section of our event. Please join me now in welcoming our distinguished speakers for their remarks. I will give the floor to the Honorable Sean Fraser, Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and current chair of MIRPS Support Platform, to address the audience with the opening remarks. Minister Fraser, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much to our moderator, and thank you so much to everyone for being here. Welcome everyone, bienvenue tout le monde, bienvenidos a todos y todas. My name's Sean Fraser, and I'm thrilled to join you as Canada's new Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from our nation's capital in Ottawa, which is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. On behalf of the Government of Canada, let me say what an honor it is to welcome you all to our high-level event as chair of the support platform for the Comprehensive Regional Protection and Solutions Framework, or MIRPS, which is just a bit easier to say. As most of you know by this stage, Canada has assumed the chair of the support platform earlier this year, and it couldn't come, in my mind, at a more important time. Addressing the migration crisis that we see globally and the forced displacement of human beings is one of the seminal issues of our time. And the COVID-19 global pandemic has only compounded the challenges that we face collectively. From welcoming vulnerable refugees to our country in Canada to helping our friends in the region, I can assure you that Canada is going to be there. And I mean that when I say it. As a chair of the support platform, we're focused on helping Central American nations and Mexico as well get the assistance that they need to help manage their challenges with forced displacement and migration, whether that support is financial, technical, or political in nature. We hope to rally nations to strengthen their protection systems, as outlined in the national action plans that I learned about during my recent visit to Guatemala. We want to support the creation and promotion of regular and safe pathways for migration and movement. Now, this is going to include refugee resettlement and other complementary pathways as well, such as community sponsorship and labor mobility programs. As part of these efforts, I had the opportunity to visit Guatemala just last week for the MIRPS annual meeting on my very first foreign visit as a federal minister in Canada. During the discussions, I had the opportunity to listen closely to how the MIRPS countries outline progress on their various national action plans. These are plans that identify concrete commitments and priorities to address the forced displacement crisis in the region. Our role as a support platform is to be actively engaged in these conversations with the MIRPS countries to help them achieve their goals. During the trip, I've got to say I had the immense privilege of meeting some inspiring young women and girls during our visit to La Alianza. And I know we're going to have a guest joining us from the organization as part of the discussion later today. This organization is a shelter and school for young women and girls who've suffered from abuse, violence, and trafficking. Frankly, when I heard their stories, the experiences that they described should shock the conscience of every one of us who's joined this meeting today. But quite sadly, I'm afraid they're not going to surprise anyone. One of the girls who guided our visit has stuck with me since I've left Guatemala. She spoke eloquently, showed us around the facility, described her experience there and the value that it brought. At one point during our visit, she gave a 5-minute speech without referring to a single note. And I couldn't help but think she might have been speaking to a cabinet minister last week. But my real hope is by investing in the kind of programs that support people in her scenario, is that next week she may be able to see in herself the potential to be a minister one day. I left La Alianza with a mixed sense of pride for some of the contributions that Canada's played alongside other donors to the organization and other similar organizations in the region. But I also left with an overwhelming sense of the need to do more so that others around the world could get the support that they so richly deserve. I want to thank in particular Ms. Carolina Escobar-Sarti, who's with us today as one of the panelists, for her extraordinary efforts in the area, and for taking the time to walk me through the principles, approaches, and strategies that underpin the transformative work that's going on in the ground that La Alianza does with young women and girls. There's lessons that I learned from that trip that I hope to share with women's resource centers in my own community here in Canada, because we don't have a monopoly on good ideas in any one country or another. And the opportunity to learn from one another is one of the most valuable assets that I think this platform is going to provide to us. I really look forward to hearing more insights from Carolina and all the other panelists joining us today, because as I said, we do have much to learn from one another. This trip to Guatemala reinforced for me the importance of the MIRPS support platform in addressing forced displacements, both its causes and its impact in Central America and Mexico. That leads me to my next point. Canada's focus as chair of the support platform this year. Led by our Prime Minister, Canada is very proud of our feminist foreign policy and our feminist international assistance policy. It's an approach that guides every one of Canada's international commitments, including our contribution as the chair of the MIRPS support platform. It's also the topic of our session today, displaced women and girls in Central America and Mexico, using the MIRPS platform, framework rather, to protect, assist, and empower. This theme also emphasizes the multifaceted nature of movement in the region, including the international protection needs and human rights of refugee and migrant women, girls, and LGBTQI+ individuals. Our goal with this theme is to draw attention to the specific needs of women and girls who are forcefully displaced and rally partners to help protect them. Tens of thousands of women and girls have fled countries in northern Central America to escape domestic and sexual violence in particular. Yet the journey north is often just as perilous as the situations that they are seeking to flee. Canada aims to raise awareness about the dangers that these groups face while they're on the move, while taking action to meaningfully address gender-based violence in MIRPS countries. According to UNHCR, there are tens of thousands of women and girls that have fled countries in the area, while members of the LGBTQI+ communities also face discrimination, violence, and persecution. These countries are demonstrating through the implementation of their national action plans, a series of concrete measures that are taking into account displaced women and girls specifically, as well as members of the LGBTQI+ community. These measures capture MIRPS countries' commitment to address areas such as protection, jobs and livelihoods, education and health and social protection. And I was thrilled to learn about some of the on-the-ground efforts when I listened to the presentations during our meetings in Guatemala. In this particular context, we've chosen to schedule this event to align it with the UN Refugee Agency's 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. Now, as many of you probably know, this international annual campaign begins on November 25th, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and it's going to conclude on December 10th, Human Rights Day. Many MIRPS nations are already leading on this effort with national action plans and measures to better protect women and girls, and we all have to support them. That's why I'm so proud to announce today, on behalf of my colleague, Minister Harjit Sajjan, Canada's Minister of International Development, a new initiative to empower and protect women and girls in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. This announcement will involve a commitment of $10 million over the next 4 years, and we'll be working with the IOM and UNHCR to assist women who've been forcefully displaced. We're going to address both the root causes of irregular migration and help women voluntarily and safely return to their home countries as part of this effort. Finally, we will work to better protect women, girls, and LGBTQI+ individuals, especially internally displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers as part of this effort. But this isn't all. Over the next months, Canada is going to be advancing both initiatives, both large and small, as part of our role as chair. Two priorities are improving in particular: the integration of newcomers and promoting complementary pathways, which means new avenues for more refugees to arrive in our countries. To demonstrate the kind of approaches that MIRPS countries might pursue, we plan to showcase Canada's innovative economic mobility pathways pilot for refugees and our world-leading community sponsorship program. Just last week, applications opened in Canada under the expanded pilot program that allows skilled refugees to come to Canada through existing economic immigration programs. Now, if you'll allow me to break from my remarks for just a moment, I can say I've seen firsthand the value that this program provides to Canada as a destination country for these refugees. There is a long-term care facility 5 minutes from my home called Glenhaven Manor that recently resettled 32 refugees who are providing care to seniors in our community, allowing people to stay in our community that otherwise would have had to leave to seek the care they need. We're able to bring a benefit to Canada. At the same time, we're helping to alleviate some of the pressures that people are facing around the world. And this is a small community of just a few thousand people. Imagine what an initiative like this could do if we scale up the ambition to small communities all over the world, like the one that I come from. And this month, I should also say that we celebrate the 5-year anniversary of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, which is assisting other countries in developing community sponsorship models. This initiative has resulted in sponsorship programs or pilots in 8 other countries. Not only do these programs allow us to welcome more refugees, they help reframe how society sees refugees. Too often I hear people talking about refugees who are looking to get something, who are a burden on the system, when in so many ways, my experience is that they're here to give something. The refugees that I've met in my own community who came through private sponsorship have started businesses that employ dozens of people. They have opened restaurants that make my community a more dynamic and vibrant place to live. And they add a new vibrancy and culture to the place that I call home. And I think we can share these lessons and success stories with countries all over the world. Now, we also want to work to strengthen and build the capacity of protection systems by increasing technical assistance we provide to countries in the region. And we're going to continue active discussions with interested partners and stakeholders to identify new opportunities for collaboration and to broaden the base of engagement in the MIRPS support platform itself. Our intent is to take a whole of society approach. This is in keeping with the Global Compact on Refugees, given the largely untapped opportunity for governments to engage with non-state actors and individuals with lived refugee experience in advancing solutions. Finally, Canada believes that we must put the forcibly displaced and their lived experiences at the heart of everything we do. We need to support refugee-led organizations and give refugees, especially women and girls, the space to share their stories with the world. As UNHCR's High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, recently noted, the world's at a watershed moment. This is a time when managing forced displacement globally requires a more comprehensive approach so that countries and communities aren't left to deal with this alone in a piecemeal way. My hope is not simply that Canada is going to heighten its ambition, but that we will choose to do more collectively as a global community. We're facing common challenges, not only regionally, but globally as well. Yet I tend to see an attitude in some parts of the world, including some parts of my own country, that we're somehow better off if we go it alone. I can't tell you how strongly I disagree with that mindset. Whether it's responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, addressing the consequences of climate change, or solving the forced displacement crisis that we're discussing today, it's clear that global problems require global solutions. People are moving in record numbers. It's up to us to decide how we're going to manage this trend collectively. Left unchecked, the most vulnerable people in the world will remain at risk. The capacity of our national systems will be overwhelmed, and unhealthy attitudes that discriminate against newcomers are going to proliferate. But if we work together, we can face these challenges in a way that will protect the vulnerable, grow our economies, and make our communities even better places to call home, not just for the newcomers who join us, but for the people who've lived there for generations. As I conclude today, I want you to know that Canada is here to help, but we also have a lot to learn. We may have a world-leading refugee and asylum system, but we also know that our geography makes it a little easier on us than on many other parts of the world. So let us learn from one another and go forward together. We might not be right next door, but there's no question that we're neighbors, and we intend to be good ones. Thank you so much, everyone. Gracias.
Thank you, Minister Fraser. Now we will continue with the opening remarks from Dr. Nelly Jerez as the MIRPS pro tempore presidency from Guatemala. Undersecretary Jerez, the floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muy buenos días,
Good morning,
distinguido honorable Sean Fraser,
Honorable Sean Fraser,
señora María del Carmen Plata, cada uno
María
de
Carmen Plata,
la Secretaría Técnica del MIRPS, ACNUR,
Technical Secretary of MIRPS,
honorables embajadores de las misiones permanentes,
Honorable
los equipos
ambassadors from permanent
técnicos que son
missions.
quienes hacen posible que el MIRPS trabaje día a día y que estemos pues actualmente en
Thank
este
you,
momento. Y a
everyone,
cada
for
uno
doing the
forman
impossible,
parte de la
working day in and day
plataforma
out to ensure we're all here together.
Es para nosotros un honor
For us,
compartir en
it
este espacio,
is an
reafirmando
honor to
el
share this
compromiso
space,
de buena voluntad de Honduras.
interpreted at a very poor sound quality at origin, which is
Permito
making it
agradecer
very
el
difficult to
compromiso y
interpret,
apoyo de la
as it is
presidencia pro
incomprehensible.
tempore de la plataforma de apoyo al MIPS, ejercida por Canadá por organizar este evento para conversar sobre la protección y el empoderamiento de las
And I'd like
mujeres
to thank Canada for convening this meeting to discuss empowerment,
en el
women's
marco del
empowerment.
MIPS. Honduras
In the
de manera
framework
particular,
of MIRPS,
llevó a cabo un
Honduras
ejercicio de actualización de cada uno de los planes
interpreting
nacionales
service
que
will
nos
resume
permitió
when sound
estable
quality
identificar buenas
improves.
prácticas y a su vez falencias en diferentes áreas temáticas. Es importante mencionar que en cada perfil se han realizado importantes acciones para asistir a las poblaciones vulnerables, fortaleciendo las capacidades estatales para la debida y oportuna atención de las poblaciones refugiadas,
Providing timely attention to refugee populations.
desplazadas internamente y retornadas con necesidades de protección. Hemos buscado orientar
We
cada uno de
have
los recursos de la cooperación internacional
been
hacia las
seeking
soluciones
to boost
duraderas,
international cooperation,
especialmente
ensuring
lo
that it is
relacionado con
sustainable.
generación de medios de vida,
Once again,
a fin de
interpreter notes
facilitar
that the sound
las
at origin
poblaciones
is
el acceso a la
making
salud,
it
la
impossible
comunicación
to
y los recursos
understand
de una
the
manera social.
speaker. Interpreting will
De igual
resume
manera,
when the
y más
sound quality
recientemente,
improves.
desde el 2021, a raíz de los cambios en la dinámica migratoria mundial, especialmente por el paso de diferentes personas en nuestro país, en nuestra región, como países de tránsito que somos, se han adecuado espacios en Honduras y procesos, espacios físicos y procesos para el recibimiento y una atención digna de cada una de estas poblaciones, así como para garantizar el respeto a sus derechos humanos. Para Honduras es un motivo de honor asumir la presidencia pro tempore del MIRPS para el año 2022. Continuaremos al frente de esta importante iniciativa con mucha responsabilidad y compromiso, trabajando para respaldar los esfuerzos realizados por las anteriores presidencias pro tempore, ampliando nuevas acciones para avanzar y hacer frente a los constantes y variables desafíos. Estamos conscientes que la movilidad de personas en todo el mundo ha incrementado, agudizando la situación humanitaria y la vulnerabilidad de miles de personas en todo el mundo. Sin embargo, como decía Sean, nuestro compromiso debe de ser firme y nos debemos de centrar en el bienestar de las personas, especialmente de aquellos los más vulnerables. MIRPS es una tarea de todos y la complementariedad que nos ha caracterizado como región debe de ser nuestro pilar para trabajar en la búsqueda de crear nexos apropiados que permitan que las cosas sucedan en beneficio de la población para la cual trabajamos y a la que nos debemos. Consideramos que habiendo pasado varios años desde el inicio de este marco, es oportuno iniciar un proceso de autoevaluación objetiva a fin de determinar dónde estamos y hacia dónde queremos llegar, considerando que la situación actual no es la misma que hace un par de años y que hace cada vez más urgente enfocarnos en soluciones duraderas, ir al campo, ir a lo local y trabajar para prevenir las migraciones y los desplazamientos que se hacen ahorita de manera irregular. Es fundamental que los recursos sean canalizados directamente a las personas en situación de vulnerabilidad o comunidades de acogida, para que éstas no tengan que enfrentarse solas a los desafíos ya mencionados, mejorando así los sistemas de respuesta nacional y internacional. Debemos trabajar en conjunto y de una manera integral
in concert
a soluciones que permitan construir un mejor futuro y lograr que
in order to build a better future.
en el marco del MIRPS,
In the framework of MIRPS,
con lo que decía Sean, si bien es cierto, nuestras fronteras,
though it is true that
somos amigos, somos hermanos, somos
interpreter again notes that the sound quality at origin is making it impossible to interpret. The speaker is cutting out and incomprehensible due to very poor sound quality.
Vamos a poder prevenir muchas más personas desaparecidas o que lamentablemente mueren en esta ruta migratoria. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Ms. Jerez, thank you for the warm welcome today. I would like to introduce Ms. Gillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the UN Refugee Agency, for her remarks. Ms. Triggs. Ms. Triggs, the floor is yours. Okay, I think we have some technical issues, so I guess is she?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, okay, I was gonna
say. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Ms. Triggs.
Okay. If you can hear me, I'll go ahead.
I think we have, okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you, Norma. Excellencies and distinguished panelists. Greetings from the United Nations Refugee Agency and from the shores of... Can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
We having some issues. I think we can hear every other word that you say. I don't know if we should maybe come back to you and maybe you can sort out the technical issues. Is that okay, Ms. Triggs? Okay, so we will come back to Ms. Triggs. I think we should probably now maybe introduce Ms. Mari Carmen Plata, Secretary of Access to Rights and Equity Organizations of American States, for her remarks. Ms. Plata.
Yes, thank you, Norma, and good morning, Your Excellencies, Minister Sean Fraser, Vice Minister Nelly Jerez, my colleague from UNHCR, Gillian Triggs. On behalf of the OAS and the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity, and also as a Central American woman, I'm both honored and also hopeful in joining everyone today. I commend the opportunity of holding this high-level event to discuss the protection and empowerment of displaced women and girls in Mexico and Central America, and thank Canada as chair of the MIRPS support platform for this initiative. I believe that we are all aware of how important it is on many levels to continue creating spaces and opportunities to come together on the issue of forced displacement in our region, particularly within the current context of the realities lived in Mexico and Central America, where an ever-increasing number of displaced women and girls continue to face violence and risk because of their gender, but also because of other intersectional characteristics such as race, sexual identity or orientation, age, or disabilities. Conversations like this provide us an opportunity to learn about the measures being adopted by MIRPS countries and to address multiple challenges they face, the lack of protection mechanisms, and the dire human rights situation faced by women and girls that are forced to leave their home countries or find themselves displaced within the Central America and Mexican regions. I will now switch to Spanish. Durante los últimos años, hemos visto cada vez con
In
mayor
the last few years, we have seen an increase in the frequency pictures of women and girls who are forced to leave everything behind as a consequence of the many types of violence, discrimination, and persecution that they experience. Images of women bearing newborns in caravans or having to go through the routes through routes in Panama. And these are some things that we see day by day that children and mothers have to face. Women suffer the emotional damage of having to leave their homelands. We also see people who have to leave and to encounter barriers to essential services in countries of origin, transit, and destination, as well as return. As we'll see later in the panel discussion today, we know that women and girls are particularly hard hit and exposed to be victims of violence, including sexual and gender violence, the violation of their reproductive and sexual rights, or they are victims of trafficking. So they are women who are displaced and refugees, and therefore doubly punished because of this. The Inter-American System of Human Rights has set up important instruments with the obligation of states to incorporate a gender in perspective, which should take into account the specific problems of women and girls in the context of forced displacement, especially the Inter-American Convention for the Prevention, Punishing, and Eradicate Violence Against Women, known as the Belén do Pará Convention. This calls upon states to adopt policies and measures to prevent, sanction, and eradicate violence against women. This convention was adopted in 1994, and its 9th article states that women are facing a position of specific vulnerability, among other reasons, to their race, their ethnic position, their position as displaced and refugees. OAS, together with the UNHCR, is supporting the MIRPS countries in the implementation of the commitments that these countries have undertaken under this framework, including incorporation of human rights and gender development and perspectives for differentiated policies. Apart from this, in the Department of Social Inclusion of the Secretariat and part of the MIRPS, we have been working very closely with the business community of Central America and Mexico due to the important role that they have for the socioeconomic improvement of displaced persons, taking special attention to the situation of displaced women and women who are refugees and returnees. We have a space of dialogue between the sector, public and private sectors, to exchange ideas on how to reduce the barriers and that companies face in hiring this population. We have set up a practical toolbox to ensure and support the private sector in helping displaced and refugee women, especially women who are asylum seekers and refugees. But we think, therefore, this question of gender violence is particularly important. We have to implement solutions for women and displaced children, and to set up and strengthen our support networks involving the work and the support of the MIRPS member countries. Finally, I'd like to express the fact that you have all the full and wholehearted support of the OAS in your help to support displaced people and refugees in the region, especially women and girls. We'd like to reaffirm our commitment to them, to you, to your families, and to our entire region. Thank you so much for this opportunity for addressing you.
Thank you very much for your presence and the important remarks shared today. Additionally, thank you very much for your support to bring this event together via the MIRPS Technical Secretariat. And we're going to see if now we can finally hear the remarks of Ms. Strings, please.
Greetings again. I'm very sorry.
Bonjour. Je vous prie de m'excuser pour ces problèmes technique. Merci aux intervenants qui ont pris la parole jusqu'à présent. Bonjour à tous les intervenants, les excellences qui nous ont rejoints. Je vous salue depuis Genève, depuis le Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies pour les réfugiés. C'est un plaisir de vous rejoindre dans cet événement sur la protection et l'autonomisation des femmes et des filles en Amérique centrale et au Mexique au moyen du cadre global de protection et de solutions régionales au déplacement forcé. Merci au ministre du Canada pour ces excellentes remarques très pertinentes. Je suis absolument d'accord avec vous. Merci pour l'organisation de cet événement. Je félicite également le Honduras et le remercie pour prendre la présidence du MIRPS pendant l'année à venir.
Our efforts to give effect to the Global Compact on Refugees, the MIRPS support platform is, I think, one of the success stories. It really shows and makes the point that Minister Fraser has made, and that is that we cannot support women and girls alone. We must do it together, whether you're a government or a state, a member of civil society, NGOs, or a United Nations agency like the UN Refugee Agency is. So thank you. So I'm pleased to be here as we consider this really vital question of how to empower and to protect displaced women and girls. It's a topic that is enormously important, and in particular, gender-based violence. It's reached what we can only say are absolutely alarming proportions globally, and is, of course, a particular issue in the Americas. It continues to be a major root cause of forced displacements. There are many causes for forced displacement, but one of those leading many thousands of women and girls and members of the LGBTIQ+ community to leave their homes to search for safety. As has been pointed out by the Minister again, we mark the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence in the Americas, and at the UNHCR we bear witness to the extraordinary numbers of people that we're dealing with. The displacement crisis has a particularly heavy toll for women and girls, LGBTI individuals. They constitute about half of 18.5 million displaced people in the region. That's about, well, certainly more than 9 million people. But of course, numbers don't really have the impact that they should have. They're incomprehensible numbers. And I think that is where it's so important that we have the opportunity to visit the region and to talk to the people who've been displaced and who suffer gender-based violence in extremely dangerous displacement circumstances. I, perhaps a little like the minister, just been to Mexico, Guatemala, and to El Salvador. And I've heard some very grave, disturbing stories of sexual abuse.
Des témoignages très graves et
of death threats and extortion.
Des menaces de mort
in fragile communities
dans des communautés fragiles
by criminal gangs. These communities continue to grapple with deep-rooted inequality and economic hardship exacerbated by the pandemic and increasingly negative consequences of climate change. But there is always a positive story, and I have been struck by the dignity, resilience, and determination and leadership that I've found among the women and girls that I met. One that had a particular impact on me as I left the region was a 13-year-old girl who had just given birth to a baby boy just a few days before we arrived. She was bewildered by what had happened to her, but she was surrounded by a safe environment, by people who cared for her and her child and who will ensure that she has some level of protection. But it was really shocking to see the plight that she'd found herself in an environment of displacement. But I also, of course, saw other positive elements, and one was the safe facility that I visited for the LGBTI community and for transgender women. Again, organizations, civil society, governments, and UN agencies, including the UN Refugee Agency, have gathered around them and provide them with effective levels of support. But in some respects, of course, they're the lucky ones. They're the ones who have found their way typically into environments, urban environments, where they can get some level of protection. The areas of engagement, of course, that we're involved in, and many of you listening to this will also be involved in ensuring empowerment and the participation of women in decision making, and ensuring that they have access to claim asylum, of course, critical to our work, and looking at alternative legal stay arrangements, looking at some of the opportunities that the Minister has outlaid with community sponsorship programs, labour mobility, education, family reunion. But we've also been trying to work on documentation. Although that seems perhaps a very technical point, the reality is that so many people on the move do not have access to documentation to prove their identity and to give them some status as they apply for asylum or apply for some form of protection. We're very concerned, of course, about the increasing number of babies born who do not have access to civil registration, which actually means that they have a risk of further displacement and denial of basic service as they grow older. So we do advocate for social economic opportunities, but particularly in these very troubled times where resettlement is so difficult to achieve and voluntary return to a place of danger is out of the question. We are advocating increasingly for inclusion within the host community. And this, again, can be advocated for in a very positive way, that the individuals concerned, the refugees, displaced people in their own countries, can, in their new locations and where they achieve protection, make a real contribution to the communities in which they live. They can rise to their own potential, they can achieve self-sufficiency, and they can assist communities. Can I, in this regard, draw your attention to the UNHCR's policy on the prevention, mitigation, and response to gender-based violence, which of course inform all of our work and support state-led responses, and they confirm our commitment to safer environments for women and girls and members of the LGBTI community. Of course, one of the elements of gender-based violence for people on the move is that it's very often underreported and statistically invisible, and it remains crucial that we continue to finance and to invest in prevention, mitigation, and protection activities. We need to ensure that national protection mechanisms are sufficiently resourced and that there is equitable access to services throughout all the stages of displacement that we see. And that, of course, can include initiatives like call centres, developing the technologies, using remote technologies for access to asylum claims and access to services. So perhaps that is one of the few silver linings that we can see in the context of COVID. So can I conclude then by reaffirming UNHCR's unwavering commitment to draw on our own experience. Of course, we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention this year. Sadly, a great deal of experience in people on the move, but in particular, the driver for displacement of gender inequality and the need to better empower women and girls and to ensure that the risks of gender-based violence are reduced. So thank you very much. I'm delighted by this event, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Back to you, Norma.
Ms. Triggs, thank you very much for your words and congratulations on your achievement progressing the objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees. As we just heard, gender-based violence is one of the factors driving women and girls and LGBTIQ+ persons to see no other option but to flee their homes in the region. At the same time, as they are on the move, they become vulnerable to more violence, trafficking, and sexual assault. In line with relevant international instruments and national arrangements, states and relevant stakeholders will seek to adopt and implement policies and programs to prevent, mitigate, and respond to GBV, as well as empowering women and girls in displaced and host communities with the aim to promote the full enjoyment of their human rights and equal access to service and opportunities. For this session, I am joined by a group of 4 women who have worked in different sectors with the same objective, to protect and generate solutions for displaced women and girls. Join me in welcoming Ms. Cecilia Alemani, Deputy Regional Director of UN Women for the Americas and the Caribbean. Ms. Carolina Escobar, Director of La Alianza Guatemala. Ms. Gretchen Kushner, Director of Women Migration Institute, and Ms. Melissa Jones, Senior Operating Officer of World Bank. Dear panelists, in our conversation, we will cover 3 topics: gender-based violence as a root cause of displacement in Central America and Mexico, advancing solutions for displaced women and girls, women's network's role on preventing and responding to forced displacement. We will now continue with the first topic of our event, gender-based violence as a root cause of displacement in Central America and Mexico. Multiple interconnected factors have forced over 900,000 people to flee their communities and countries in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador between 2011 and 2020 to protect themselves and their families from violence, persecution, insecurities, and inequality. Gender-based violence is one of the main reasons why people are forced to flee. Tackling the root causes of displacement requires a gender analysis. Gender-based violence is a serious violation of human rights and a life-threatening health and protection issue, and represents a threat especially to women, girls, LGBTIQ+ persons. Understanding the gaps and needs will support identifying solutions to address GBV as a root cause of displacement. To start this section, we will watch a short testimony to provide a first-hand experience to this topic.
Cuando nacieron mis hijos, todo marchaba bien. Después que murió la mamá de él se metió a drogas, a los vicios, y ya empezó él a cambiar mucho. Y ya empezó el maltrato doméstico, se puede decir, ya todo cambió. Ya él ya no volvió a ser el mismo, ya llegaba tomado, llegaba en las madrugadas, en la mañana. No teníamos muebles ni nada, y un vecino me regaló un mueble, todo malo. Y yo me puse a reparar el mueble, y por estar reparando ese mueble, los otros niños brincó encima del mueble y mi niño mayor me estaba ayudando. Y se desprendió el resorte y se le introdujo en el ojo a mi niño de 10 años. Y fue ahí donde yo dejé el miedo, me descontrolé de una manera que yo me fui al hospital con mi niño. Él llegó bien tomado allá, empezó a llorar, empezó a pedirme perdón. Y yo le dije que yo nunca le iba a perdonar nada. Después en eso lo agarró una vez la policía, le hallaron la droga bajo la cama y él dijo que yo lo había denunciado. Y lo llevaron con los niños, que lo querían quitar los niños. Anduvieron a mis niños en la patrulla con la droga. Y ya todo eso a mí me hizo, digo yo, no, este hombre no. Y él me dijo, yo voy a salir y te voy a matar. Él me dijo que no me quería volver a ver en su casa, que si él al salir y me encontraba, él me iba a matar. Y sí, yo estaba segura que lo iba a hacer porque yo sé que conmigo era un hombre bien violento. Tenía un hermano de que venía para acá, para mí, y me trajo para acá. Y entonces yo lloré porque abandoné mis hijos. Yo dejé mis hijos, los 4 hijos. Y yo sabía de que iba a tener mucho tiempo que no los iba a volver a ver. Y ya después yo no tenía papeles ni para siquiera llegar hasta Guatemala. Cuando me doy cuenta que estoy aquí, que me han ayudado tanto Omar, todos ustedes, ACNUR, toda migración, yo siento una gran paz, una gran alegría. Y ahora el reto que yo tengo es que reunirme con mi gente, con mis hijos, con mis nietos.
We will start our conversation with Ms. Gretchen Kushner, Director of Women Migration Institute. Dear Ms. Kushner, in your opinion, how is violence against women and girls a driver of displacement in the subregion, and has the COVID-19 pandemic has had any additional effect?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Norma, and thank you everybody who's here today to participate in this really important conversation. I work in a civil society organization in Mexico City, and we focus on direct legal representation for women in migration and asylum seekers in Mexico, and those who also seek other immigration remedies. And we also provide direct legal representation to Mexican women who have been deported or returned from the US. So we have this sort of regional focus. And the Central American women that we work with are primarily from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So I wanted to focus my remarks on those three countries from the perspective of the women who we work with in the organization. First of all, in terms of drivers, from what we've seen over the last 11 years that we've been working on these issues, gender-based violence, including rape and sexual assault, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, hate-based violence against LGBTQ+ people, and femicide permeate the lives of children and women in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and is and remains one of the main drivers of forced migration. But also, as previous speakers have said, violence is combined with other factors, such as poverty, lack of access to employment, lack of access to health services, discrimination, a huge issue of impunity and corruption in the region, as well as factors related to climate change. And these all play an interactive role in driving displacement. The types of violence that the women explain to us, tell us about are physical violence, emotional violence, psychological, economic, sexual, and gender-based violence. And that violence is employed through sexual harassment, domestic violence, community and institutional violence. And we also have really high levels of femicide in those three countries in Northern Central America and also in Mexico. Unfortunately, gender-based violence not only drives women to leave their countries, but the violence that they experience in Mexico exacerbates their trauma and becomes a key factor in pushing them through or out of Mexico. We have to ask our clients not only what type of violence they confronted in their country of origin, but also what has happened to them before they reach us, whether it's in Mexico City or whether we're taking a remote case in there in another part of Mexico. One of the questions that we ask in each case is, how did the expression of violence in that particular woman's experience create characteristics of vulnerability that accentuate her risk of suffering new violence? Because what we want to do is, once we're with the woman, we have the opportunity to help that person. We want to also be able to train her and work with her so that she's not as vulnerable to new types of violence, especially if she's going to continue to live or travel in Mexico. I wanted to put just a special emphasis on violence in the home, which was so exacerbated during COVID. You know, it's just incredible to us the amount, I mean, there's all different kinds of violence that occurs in the home, but intimate partner violence, I think that, you know, it's women who have experienced violence in the home. The majority of them tell us that they would never have reported it to, you know, the police. So that goes back to access to justice and also the high levels of impunity. And then gang violence continues to be what women tell us that they've been suffering in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Of the people who we represent, 85% declared that they lived in areas controlled by criminal armed groups. Women often face gender-based violence by gangs or criminal groups who threaten them for disrespecting them, for not paying the tax or the piso in certain territories. Women report that they have to hide indoors from their with their children. And then that creates this, you know, exacerbates this kind of chain reaction, right? So children aren't able to go to school because of the fear, or they go to school and then they're recruited. And women have a hard time going out into the public sphere and working. Gang practices promote violence and devalue women. And we've also seen that the dominance of gangs throughout the country make it difficult for women in Northern Central America to move internally in a safe way. Where we want internal movement to be safe for people. And we're looking at this in Mexico as well, with the huge numbers of internally displaced now in Mexico. And then of the 4 countries, including Mexico, there are extremely high rates of femicide. And then something that I think that Jillian mentioned is this intersectionality. It's so incredibly important when we're looking at the drivers of displacement to take into account factors, whether it's LGBTQI populations that face incredible discrimination in all of our countries, and hate violence, as well as Indigenous and Afro-descendant women and girls who also face additional risks to violence and barriers to access to justice. And then finally, the question about what has changed in terms of COVID. It was interesting because immigration went way down at the beginning of the pandemic. But it also has to do with the fact that NGOs, we were not able to document people, we weren't able to go into detention centers as well. And so we weren't able to document the types of violence that were occurring, at least within the immigration movements during at least 2020. But what we did see in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Mexico was a huge increase in sexual violence against children within the family home. And then we also experienced this terrible frustration with barriers to access to justice, because even if we found out about cases, lots of times the court systems were closed. And another thing that had a huge impact on women was the lack of access to birth control and sexual and reproductive rights assistance, healthcare, birth control, and in Mexico, access to legal abortion. Those issues during COVID came up over and over and over again for the women that we were trying to help remotely, because we were able, and I think that Jillian mentioned this as well, we were able to continue to meet with women on Zoom and provide emotional support to them. So, but that's one of the things that I think hit women the most, was the types of violence, the precarity, and then also the lack of access to health, to other types of health services during the COVID crisis. So I'll leave that with the first set of comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question is to Ms. Carolina Escobar, Director of La Alianza Guatemala. Based on your experience, how does gang violence impact the displacement of women and girls, including the risk of forced recruitment and sexual exploitation? And how can we mitigate the impact? Ms. Carolina Escobar.
Muy buenos días a todas y a todos.
Good morning, all. Greetings to Honorable Minister Sean Fraser.
It was great to have you here in La Alianza, as also Jillian Triggs, and mucho gusto Nelly, mucho gusto Carmen Plata y al resto de panelistas.
Wonderful, Nelly and Carmen Platt and other panelists to see you here. It's a great honor to be here. We're very grateful for this. It is a very complex problem and very complex question, actually. But sometimes I think that I'm exaggerating, and it's a fiction when I see the figures of what is happening in my country, and which are confirmed in the bodies of the girls and the emotional, physical, spiritual suffering of these girls and women and adolescents, of women up to the age of 25, 26 years. They're all victims of trafficking and sexual violence and other types of violence that, as was said before, need us to have a wide-ranging, comprehensive and intercultural approach, an intersectional approach. I'm going to start very quickly and refer to a number of figures, because the question is to see how gender violence and gang violence affects women, girls, adolescents, and how what type of impact this has on their lives and how we can work to mitigate these impacts. I just like to say that there's something structural at work here. In Guatemala, 1 of every 2 girls less than 5 is chronically undernourished. And of course, this gives us an idea of for the middle and long-term situation of the future generations. But many of the mothers of these are indigenous women. Many of these figures do not come out of the organization. The official figures that we have from the observatories and public instances and bodies are from this 1,530 women disappeared, as the public ministry said. According to a census, half of our population is indigenous, and 51% of the population of the population of our country is made up of women. Another figure that we think that is extremely speaking is that between 2020 to 2020, over 20 years, we have 12,800 people, women were killed, cases of femicide, and only in 8 months we have 396 murders of women. Another figure that I think that is quite arresting is that last year, that is in 2020, we had more than 104,000 women and girls, young girls, who were pregnant, and 89% of the women, the men are, and a large percentage of these were the fathers were biological fathers of these women and girls. So just these figures, and of course we have so many more when we look at the educational system, and especially the pre-primary and primary areas. When we talk about those who have least access to health services, when we talk about opportunities, working opportunities, and political representative of women, we see a scenario which is quite horrible.
Que existiera, pero esa es la
I
realidad.
wish this didn't exist, but it's something we've been working on in all 3 countries. And when we talk about forced displacement in this region, we need to talk about the fact that, for example, in our case, over 200,000 cases of IDP took place during the war, and that still has an effect on us. And then you add this to the displacement caused by the gang, and that's the second part of the question. How does gender violence affect girls, teens, and women? And forced recruitment, how does that affect them? It affects them in the fact that, and there has been some research on this, but in the gangs, there is a very patriarchal system in play, and it is very concentrated. It's very vertically organized. There's a strong hierarchy, and it's very clear within the gangs. And in the gangs, they also talk about a sort of family identity in the group, and the women, particularly if they belong to the homeboys, because they're going to belong to somebody, and the homeboy is the leader of the organization, and that within that gang, and or the clique, as they call it, which are smaller organizations within the gang. And so they're part of these groups that have also been evolving, because during the 80s, the gangs were very different from how they are today. And now they have mini armies that have been designed for organized crime. And then they have different types of relationships, not only at the country level, but at the entire region level. And so the women join these groups, and that is where you see violence taking place. It's gender-based violence, and it's very compressed and compact, much more so than in society in general. And so when there is the gang leader who has somebody, and the gang leader's girlfriend is free, another gang leader has the right to that woman, but not someone below her, because of this hierarchy in play. And so they make sure that the girl doesn't get involved with anyone else, or they'll kill them. The group watches over the children, And for example, if someone wants to leave the gang or is the sister of a gang member, and we've had many cases like this, they shoot them and they leave them there for dead. Sometimes we have had to perform surgery on girls in the ambulance because of the injuries that they have received. They open up the stitches that were performed at the hospital and then they attack them again. It's like straight out of a movie. And so I believe that gender violence has direct victims, but it also has a lot of indirect victims. It is a mechanism for repression. It's intergenerational in nature. It is a practice that is terrorizing. Other women see it and they learn from that. And so we have girls who have been raped three or four generations in a row by the same man in the house. And so how do we mitigate the impact of something like that? And I'm about to finish, but the answer is within such a complex, huge problem, the answer needs to be comprehensive. And that means that we need to have a human rights approach. And we need to look at intersectionality, gender, and in our case, we also need to look at culture. We also need to work on 4 major pillars. That is protection, prevention, access to justice, and also innovative policies and legislation that will close educational, social, and economic gender gaps. And this needs to always be at the very heart of everything we do. I think it's also important to say that there is a Gallup poll that states that in the world, around the world, women feel less safe than men, and that varies from generation to generation, from country to country. But here, women feel unsafe. And in the video that we showed you at the beginning, we see a reflection of that when women are able to actually leave that context behind. And they have all of the opportunities ahead of them. But before that, we need to provide a comprehensive response so that we can see success later.
We have a lot to cover, and I know these issues are very, very complex, but I need to remind you that we have about 5 minutes to answer the question. So let's do our best. I know it's incredibly interesting, but we have a lot to cover. So now, Ms. Cecilia Almali, Deputy Regional Director of UN Women for the Americas and the Caribbean. How can the MIRPS countries support the strengthening of the national protection system to better protect displaced women and girls survivors of GVB?
Gracias, Norma, por la pregunta. Buenos días a todas.
Thank you very much, Norma, for the question. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for this space and being able to join this great panel and the previous speakers. And thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to listen and join Gretchen Kuhner, Carolina Escobar, and Melissa in a few minutes. Of course, as we have heard from the beginning, we are talking about human rights violations in all stages of the human mobility chain. And it is both a cause and a consequence of migration. And adopting an intersectional approach is one of the main responses, human rights approach and intersectional approach. We heard that from Gillian Triggs and many of the other speakers before, because of course, this helps us to design and implement responses, policy responses that can transform these historical discriminations that women face in Latin America and that the previous speakers show very well, Gretchen from Mexico and Carolina from Guatemala. And obviously, displacement root causes are linked with the lack of economic opportunities and the naturalization of gender-based violence in our societies. So a few recommendations to go short and straight to the timing request by the moderator. First, we need to strengthen regional cooperation and sub-regional cooperation within MIRPS countries. And many of the proposals that I'm going to share here from UN Women are relevant for all MIRPS countries, but also to Canada and the US as destination countries and major cooperation actors in the region. So first of all, the focus should be a more effective provision of the essential services for GBV victims and to revert the setback from COVID-19. We touched a bit before on the impact of COVID-19, but overall in the region, we see a regression just about labor participation of around 18 years. So all what we did the last 18 years to ensure women's income and autonomy, economic autonomy in the region has been erased in less than 2 years. And these imply exceptional solutions from all of us. We published very recently a policy brief to tackle gender-based violence, to migration and forced displacement. And I would like just to share 2 blocks of policy recommendations. The first block, of course, is to develop and implement targeted laws and policies. And here we call to ratify and implement international and regional instruments to address, of course, GBV, but also women migrant workers and displaced women and girls, to expand the pathways for admission and stay for migrant women and girls and LGBTIQ+ at risk of survivors of GBV, to continue to promote multi-stakeholders dialogues at this one, but also at the local level and at the borders level, to have strengthened coordinated strategies and actions that can prevent and respond and make a coordinated management in borders and transits. And the second block, it's really speaking to the points made before on how to strengthen the provision of essential services. So as we all know, first we need to ensure access to reliable information on services for survivors, their families and communities, particularly in their appropriate and indigenous languages that we know many of us are doing this effort in the field to do so. And we have to really ensure the coordinated quality essential services, the strengthening the ecosystem to not find these gaps in the system, as Gretchen was sharing, for example, in terms of access to justice, irrespective of their migration status. And this is, I think, it's a non-negotiable recommendation that we all should be pushing for across the region. We have to continue to provide training on gender responsive training for all health, justice, and social service providers and migration authorities and security authorities all across the region. Clearly, COVID-19 restrictions and mobility restrictions imply additional risks for women and girls. And at the end of the day, what we need to see, and could be an opportunity, we know this is not automatic, but from this crisis that is longer than all what we wanted at the beginning of 2020, we have to strengthen governance and coordination through regional, multilateral, as well as bilateral agreements, particularly on social protection and the cross-border linkage with embassies and consular offices to support those women and girls at risk. And we need separate immigration enforcement activities for the provision of these essential services. And last but not least, we want to also call for the visibility and protection of women's human rights defenders and specialized women's organizations who are also at risk in many of these countries as of today. And I hope I kept some care of the time. If not, sorry.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And sorry, this is so interesting, but we do have a lot to cover. Our second topic is advancing solutions for displaced women and girls. Gender-based violence disproportionately affects women and girls. And in situations of displacement, the risk of exposure to GBV increases. Working towards the empowerment and self-reliance of women, girls, and LGBTIQ+ persons is key to prevent and mitigate the risk related to GBV. Displaced women and girls have a great resiliency, and supporting their empowerment is key to achieve sustainable solutions. We will watch our second testimony.
Pues yo salí de mi país por la delincuencia.
I left my country due to crime, and we were really struggling to have our own business there. We were merchants, and because of the crime, we were not able to get ahead because each week we had to pay rent to the criminals, and we didn't have enough money for that. And so we were being threatened with death. They approached my husband constantly, and they gave us really nasty threats. And I was threatened. They said that it was my second warning and I had to pay them. I refused. They said the third time there wouldn't be a warning, that there would be a response. When they shot at us and they wounded my oldest son in the head, and that was extremely traumatic because it was very hard for him to survive and overcome that. And then they beat my husband. They beat him up horribly. They took his merchandise, they took his motorcycle, and they said that we had had enough warnings. And we went to UNHCR asking for refuge, and I gave so much thanks to God when we received it, because they gave me support. They have been helping me at UNHCR. I have no idea how I can ever thank you, because yes, they really helped us a lot. And they gave us a place to sleep. They gave us economic assistance. We have been working a lot in Chiapas and Tapachula to get ahead, and they sent us here. I've been here since 2019, and we arrived on January 18th, 2019, and since that day, my life has changed drastically. We've had jobs, we've had our health support more than anything, and honestly, I don't know what we would have done without this help. We have met people who have helped us so much. They have given us so much support, and we've had help for our friends. A lot of people have asked us, why don't you go to the United States? I'm not looking to go to the United States. I just want stability. I want my life. I want my children to go to school. And for us to have jobs. Yes, we have jobs here. There's work here. There's help for my children.
Dear panelists, we will continue our dialogue based on a series of questions addressing the integration of gender equality empowerment into development activities to ensure sustainable solutions for women and girls, and for an effective and sustainable development outcome in the region. We will now start with Ms. Melissa Jones, Senior Operator and Officer, World Bank. Ms. Jones, from your experience, how can development actors further support MIRPS member states and communities affected by displacement to advance solutions for displaced women and girls in the region?
Well, thank you very much, Norma, for the question. And I want to thank the governments of Canada and Honduras, as well as UNHCR and the OAS, for including the World Bank in this very important conversation today. I very much appreciate this focus on protection and empowerment of displaced women and girls, because I think we all know, and we can see through these videos and through our own work, that displaced women and girls are forces, and we want to make sure that they can contribute fully to their new communities and environments, because no country can achieve its potential without the full participation and contributions of all of its community members. So perhaps I'll give a little bit of context about the World Bank's perspective on forced displacement. Our approach is very much anchored in our poverty reduction mandate. We have two goals as an organization, and that is to reduce poverty and to boost shared prosperity. So we see ourselves as a part of a broader effort that includes security, diplomatic, and of course, humanitarian components. And we seek to be complementary to, but distinct from, the humanitarian efforts here. So we very much are led by economists, and economists talk a lot about comparative advantages. And so we see the World Bank's, as an institution, our comparative advantages being financing, analytics, and policy making. And we focus very much on the medium-term and socioeconomic dimensions of a displacement situation, excuse me, both to support the forcibly displaced communities and their hosts as well. And I think that's been touched upon by several of the speakers already. So now in the context of MIRPS and the communities affected by displacement, I can see several ways in which development actors can support the MIRPS member states to advance the protection and empowerment of girls and women. This may be through providing economic support to help mitigate the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on displaced people and their host communities. It could be through supporting the registration and identification of displaced girls and women in educational and health services, both to bring them into the national systems, as discussed by Assistant High Commissioner Triggs, but also to provide with the very specific psychosocial support and targeted educational interventions that might best meet their needs. I think Director Escobar and Sarthi spoke very eloquently on some of those specific needs. Another way that development actors might support the MIRPS member states could be to strengthen the national statistical capabilities to better identify displaced communities and their particular demographic characteristics. This would help shape more impactful interventions. And in other areas in policymaking, perhaps to support the expansion of the right of displaced women to work legally. Of course, to gain access to all of the formal employment benefits like pensions, sick leave, insurance, etc. We know that women are disproportionately represented in the informal economy, and bringing them into the formal employment can help displaced populations better contribute to the country's overall economic health. So I can go on to other areas in which development actors and international finance institutions can offer this assistance. But I really want to go back to one of the points that Vice Minister Jerez emphasized, and that is that our engagement is really shaped by our relationships with the country government. So we engage in the way that they want us to engage. The areas I mentioned here are ways in which we as the World Bank have provided services or support or financing analytics for displaced communities in other parts of the world. And these could be relevant for the MIRPS member states, but the role of the international financial institutions, including the World Bank, is in advancing the country's own efforts and following their priorities. So I very much liked what Vice Minister Jerez said, that MIRPS is the work of everyone. I think this conversation is an excellent way today to talk across the various actors on how we can all partner strongly with the MIRPS member states as they seek to advance their own efforts to face the challenges of protecting and empowering displaced women and girls in their own countries. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. The next question goes to Ms. Cecilia Alemani. From your point of view, how are states and humanitarian organizations promoting local integration of displaced women and girls?
Thank you, Norma. As we have seen, we from the different international organizations and also it's in their own role and obligation to protect, are seeing that it's also urgent to increase women's and young women's autonomy and economic empowerment. And this is pretty linked with the different efforts to foster employability of women, the creation of business and decent work and the promotion of education. In this sense, of course, from international organizations, and I go on what we are doing, we call MIRPS countries to carry out activities focused on this, strengthening employability conditions, business creation for displaced women and young women, and ensuring their education. We are all working from different places on how to really make a qualitative change in qualification, skills development, and labor inclusion, including access to digital competencies in alliances with national training institutes, local centers, and local authorities. And maybe just an example on this is what we call initiatives led by local partners, including indigenous women's communities and UN Women Second Chance Education Program, that is really looking at providing opportunities for these displaced young women and teenagers to continue their formal education process and identify strategies for their future empowerment. This is very successful at the local level, but we have to all together find a way to match the local level initiatives those that are, in the different changes of mobility and the macro policies that we have tackled in the previous blocks. We are missing the meso level all around, both in terms of territorial level actions and the different stages of mobility. Another example is to work together, and many development authorities are strengthening alternatives of local territorial models on local economic development. And many of the actors sitting here have been crucial in supporting and strengthening capacities, not only to build or bridge the gap of those women that are really left behind on this new in this new economy and the digital world, but also in terms of reducing the digital gap, but also in terms of building capacities and strengthening local value chains and their connection to regional and global value chains. In this sense, we have been working in the region between Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador in a women's economic empowerment program all these years called MELIT, interlinked with the national local development agencies, the different networks of women to really strengthen access to pay and dignified work, access to productive assets and land, access to technology, articulation and local economic policies and recovery policies between the local and the national incentives that many countries have been pushing as a response to COVID-19, and of course, management capacity. We see a lot of efforts and initiatives on the ground within women that are displaced or facing different challenges of mobility. But many of these times, these economic empowerment initiatives are just a reproduction of poverty and a reproduction of vulnerability. We really need to work together, and a lot of efforts are done in this sense to build capacities that really strengthen their qualifications and skills for labor inclusion and business initiative, and supporting what exists already on the field and their integration to the local rural women's cooperatives, SMEs, and the different networks that exist already at the community level, but are not always easy opening for those that are in transit or in a displaced situation. So lastly, labor intermediation and strengthening capacities to access to jobs and maintain their jobs wherever they are. It's one of the key priorities. And of course, other UN agencies as ILO and many others strengthening women's autonomy in the region are wishing to strengthen together. This requires support from all, the local governments, the chambers, the possibility also to open markets, not only at the local level, but also at the regional and at the global level, and international cooperation, as we see it today, of course, with partners from Canada and the US, may be keen, as it was in the past, to strengthen the situation and the possibility of success of these local autonomy initiatives that are happening in all the transits towards the US and Canada. I'm stopping here because I know we have more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question is for Gretchen Kudner. I don't see her in the camera, so I don't know if she can hear me. We have the same, yeah, the next question is for you, Ms. Kudner.
Okay, here I go.
Camera, okay. If you can just turn so we can see you. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Okay, so, okay, there we go.
Okay, Ms. Kudner. Next question is for you. Last question. From your work in the region, what are some best practices when it comes to promoting the promotion of solutions for displaced women and girls?
Okay, so I'm going to go from the specific to the general. We just did sort of a brainstorm. The first category is assisting women and girls who have been displaced and who are seeking protection. And in this category, ensuring that lawyers, psychologists, social workers, that we are all trained to identify the types of violence that women and girls experience, that we are providing psychological support during all legal representation. It's so important to help women move through the process and understand their violence during our legal representation process. Work with individual women and girls in groups to employ strategies to deconstruct gender stereotypes so that women and girls are identifying the types of violence inflicted upon them and that they're learning their rights, at least as part of this process of being displaced. We're also exploring programs focusing on masculinities, working with other organizations that are training and offering emotional and psychological training and support to perpetrators. Utilizing intersectional analysis to identify multiple vulnerabilities of the victims of sexual and gender-based violence, including LGBTQI groups, particularly transgender women. We see it all the time that they're so incredibly vulnerable to sexual violence. Indigenous and Afro-descendant groups, look at language, age, education, socioeconomic status, and then also what part of the country did you come from, a rural area, an urban area. Help women's organizations work in networks. It's so helpful for us now, and the technology I've seen over the last 20 years develop has helped us so much, being in touch with local organization in groups, you know, who are working in countries of origin, who can maybe give you a heads up or call you and say someone's been detained. That's so helpful. Applying the analysis in the UNHCR and OAS guidelines. I mean, we've seen over the years, you know, how the whole structure of analysis about gender-based violence and persecution based on, you know, social group or gender has been now included in laws, and that analysis, I think, is so helpful. Preventing violence in the transit or country of destination. It's so important for women to be able to have regular pathways with work authorization and access to formal employment. We need to be promoting within that access to regular migration, family unity. We see so often women, you know, leaving Mexico in a regular form, going back and trying to get their children in Central America and come back to Mexico. We could avoid that if we had better family reunification or non-separation included in regular migration pathways. Alternatives are eliminating migration detention. And then there's this whole series of, once you're here, access to education, you know, the whole issue about documentation is so important. We spend a lot of time going to civil registries, making sure people have, you know, their, first of all, a birth certificate, but also passports, national ID cards, et cetera, which are oftentimes, you know, the door to reaching or to accessing other rights. Access to justice, which I already mentioned, and health services, especially in the context of COVID. Facilitating that organizations, women organizations, can accompany other women who are being displaced, whether it's in caravans or the recent programs that, you know, people have started in the Darien Gap, where we knew that thousands of women were being raped. Then in the category, and I'm going to turn this around just a little bit to finish, migration policies and practices in the region. If we want to do protection, the governments need to do protection. So that means eliminating illegal practices that violate access to asylum, such as MPP and Title 42 on the Mexican US border. In Mexico, eliminating the use of the National Guard and the armed forces and immigration control has just had an incredibly terrible impact on women and violence against women in their time in Mexico. Eliminate discriminatory internal immigration and control, such as the vertical border in Mexico, and that goes to the way that the 4,000 immigration agents and the 26,000 National Guard agents are detaining women, and that just pushes them into more dangerous parts, and it also pushes them into smuggling, you know, smuggling schemes, because they have no other way to find protection. And then just to finish, promoting women's participation in civil society and community-based solutions. And then other people have mentioned the need to protect human rights defenders, Indigenous women leaders in the region who are advocating to protect the environment. Also, we're very concerned about civil society in Mexico and Central America and the way that there are more restrictive tendencies and fiscal restrictions that are really hampering the ability of civil society to advance. And then finally, just trying to change this criminalization narrative. Women are criminalized for being victims of violence. And then when they try to seek protection, they're criminalized for just being migrants and trying to seek protection as refugees.
Thank you. We will now continue with our third and final topic, women's empowerment, networks' role on preventing and responding to forced displacement. Grassroots organizations, including women-led, refugee-led, and LGBTIQ+ organizations play a key role in the prevention, risk mitigation, and response to GVV, and working towards the empowerment of women and girls in the context of forced displacement. Working on sustainable solutions requires the joint efforts in different sectors of different sectors and communities are often at the heart of those as they better understand the needs and solutions required. The engagement, leadership, and participation of local organizations and local leaders, particularly women and LGBTIQ+ persons, is critical to achieve medium and long-term impact. I have the pleasure to introduce you to our third testimony, Ms. Bianca Rodriguez, activist and human rights defender in El Salvador since 2017. She is the director of the NGO Concavis Trans, an organization that works to promote, defend, and advocate to guarantee the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons in El Salvador. In 2019, Bianca was recognized as the Americas Regional Nansen winner for her leadership in defense of the rights of forcibly displaced LGBTI persons in El Salvador in the region. Bianca is UNHCR's first trans high-profile supporter. Ms. Bianca, the floor is all yours.
Bueno, reciban todos y todas.
Thank you. Good morning to you all. I'd like to thank all of the people who were attending this webinar. As you already said, my name is Bianca Rodriguez. I am a transgender woman. And this ongoing struggle to defend the human rights of LGBTI women and persons in El Salvador and the region, I would like to stress the fact that El Salvador and the Central American region, in this time, trans women are the highest, represent the highest number of forcibly displaced person. From 2015 to 2020, the organization that I recognize, which is Concavis Trans, has been able to support 500 transgender persons who were victims of violence and who were forced to be internally displaced because of this violence to which they were subjected. 60% of that 528 cases were women. The violence and discrimination, harassment and persecution, and attempts of murder and actual murders are the main causes of this violence. In the region, the numbers of murders of LGBT persons is, I could go into a little bit in detail. For example, in 2019 to 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially as this pandemic continued in 2020, 689 LGBT persons were murdered in 9 countries. This is an alarming figure, especially since in these 9 countries, most of the murders have been documented in the Central American region. These countries, in fact, their there has been no access to justice, for the LGBT persons who are being persecuted. I just like to mention that not only are we victims of violence as such, but we're victims also of exclusion and systemic discrimination, and prevented from enjoying our own rights. These are fundamental rights for us and for our social, economic, and labor development. And here I must also talk about the need to find livelihoods for LGBTQI people, especially trans women who are excluded because of their identity and their gender expression. We also have to strengthen the possibilities for health and education, because most of the LGBTQ population are excluded from access to these services. Also, it is important to mention, as was also mentioned in those who preceded me in this, is that community work of empowerment and in enhancing the autonomy of women in their territory. As an organization, I've worked to strengthen this in the committee empowerment of vulnerable people, LGBTQ people. We not only do we have to strengthen the systems of protection, we have to have active participation, comprehensive participation in decision-making spheres, where the work of CONCAVE is supported. Because as we give a voice to the leaders will in turn participate and raise your voice in the decision-making spheres and ensure the participation of these persons who are affected. We have tried and worked to fight against the effects of COVID-19, as well as the great gap which we suffer with the creation of livelihood and giving access to humanitarian assistance. And this I must stress, because most of the states, institutions, and governments, as well as cooperation agencies and institutions of civil society, center their efforts on humanitarian assistance. But refugees and displaced persons not only need humanitarian efforts, but they also have comprehensive efforts to guarantee the full employment and enjoyment of their rights. Well, as an institution, we have, as I said before, we have worked with community leaders. And of course, this is a work that goes hand in hand with violence prevention.
Sorry, I think we lost the audio, but thank you very much, Ms. Bianca, for addressing us. And I would like, dear panelists, we will continue our dialogue based on the series of questions addressing the role of and importance of the women-led and LGBTIQ plus grassroots movements and organizations and the promotion of gender equality and protection of women and girls on the move. We have two final questions regarding this topic. Ms. Escobar, in your opinion, how can we further engage communities, especially women-led and LGBTQI plus grassroots organizations, to actively participate in the response to forced displacement across the region?
Muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you very much for the question. I'd just like to start with what Bianca just said. We give support and not to represent. And I think that is fundamental, because in fact, I was going to answer by saying that the first thing that we should do in the communities, it would seem to be very small, but it is indeed important, and that is to listen to women. And here I'm including girls, adolescents, and women of all ages. We are more and more organizations that are led by young women, indeed very young women. This year, for example, we had, and in our partnerships, we worked with girls and adolescents who set up an alternative report that is going to be presented in Geneva to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, so that they can also express and say exactly how they felt. Now, going back to the question, how can we include women in the communities, especially the grassroots women's organizations, to ensure that they participate more actively in the responses to displacement? We must give women something that touches their lives. So the strategy must be comprehensive, but it must touch their lives in a positive way, something that is going to be better for them and their families. That is what you must focus on. When we talk about comprehensive work in the communities to prepare these grassroots communities, we are talking about protection, yes, but we're also going to talk about prevention of violence, all types of violence. We now have corruption, drug trafficking, gangs, and depending on the area in which we work, thirdly, we talked about the access to justice in the courts, with respect to the families as well as criminal courts. And lastly, we must work with governments and other civil society organizations as well as international organizations. This is fundamental because this is a response that we must all give. It must not be only sectoral, it must be an integral across the board in its scope. So I think it is very important that we should have short, medium, and long-term actions, because to reimagine these communities, to reimagine these countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, this is a long-term effort. It will take us about 25 years. And there is another important for the medium term, which has to do with essential needs, which were, as we heard from the testimonies, these needs are fundamental because these contexts depend to a great extent on the lives of the girls and women as well as the displaced groups. So we have short-term humanitarian emergency actions, we have other medium-term actions that have to do with prevention, and other more long-term actions that have to do with rebuilding. In this specific case of Guatemala, I just wanted to say that language is a fundamental factor, because sometimes we forget, but for example, access to justice for women who do not speak Spanish is still an enormous obstacle in that country. So we have to understand the dynamics of each territory. That is very important. And the strategy that sometimes we want it to be integrated in order to have progressive autonomy and to have independence. This has to do also with the diagnostic examination that we should do for all the territories in which we provide services. And I'd like to end by saying that in Guatemala, there's everything. We have generalized violence, we have gender violence, we have violations of human rights, we have corruption, natural disasters, and disasters that are provoked by other circumstances. Of course, we still have the responses and the repercussions of war. We have to have a psychosocial attention. We have specialized attention with respect to services. We must have social policies that really touch and affect the population. Women must be educated and know how to manage their money. Economic independence comes from all of this comprehensive approach. And in Guatemala, women are afraid of managing their money, especially in the rural areas. Generally, they give their money to the husbands, to the men who manage the money for the entire family. So this is a part of the actions that would seem small, but mean that we have to learn them, to teach them, and to support them how to make a budget, for example. They should not be afraid of money, and that they should become autonomous. We have to remember that women are responsible for social cohesion in the communities, and that is a factor that we must also take note of. So we all have a commitment that we reaffirm, but with respect to them, and I'm going to finish with what I started. We have to support, not to represent, but to do this, the outset, we have to listen. And this is where I'll stop. Thank you so much.
In your opinion, Ms. Jones, how can development actors support women's network and organizations in the prevention of violence and to protect and empower women and girls at risk or in situations of forced displacement? Do you have an example of our best practices?
Okay, thanks, Norma. I think I'll start where I ended last time, and that the development institutions really work primarily with governments to advance their priorities when it comes to forced displacement. But this intersects with the very important role of women's networks and organizations in two fundamental ways. One is on institutional reform and expansion of government services. And here I'll give the example of a development policy financing that was just approved last month for the government of Colombia. This was an $800 million loan that was delivered jointly by the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank to support the social and economic integration of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. So it was a massive effort from a variety of different institutions supporting the government to expand the regularization and management of information about the Venezuelan population in Colombia. It also mainstreams migrants from Venezuela into the subsidized health insurance system and the formal educational systems. It also supports the system of housing subsidies and their inclusion in the formal labor market. And the financing provides social protection services to vulnerable migrants, including children and victims of human trafficking. So it's a great new model of financing that was given for Colombia that I would love to see extended to other parts of Latin America, perhaps in MIRPS member states, or certainly in other parts of the world. I'll also mention another way that the World Bank and other development agencies can support women's networks and organizations is through its data and analytics. And here I'll highlight a few initiatives that are supportive of the effort of the MIRPS platform. One is the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. This is a joint effort between the World Bank and the UNHCR to improve the availability and accessibility of high quality socioeconomic data on displaced populations. It functions globally, but in 2022, so in next year, the center will fund a dedicated internally displaced person survey in Honduras. This will be delivered by the Honduran National Statistical Office to help inform the national governments and the international communities and civil society's response to internal displacement with better data and more inclusive data, socioeconomic information. I'll also highlight Nomad, which is the global knowledge platform on migration and development. It is housed at the World Bank. It does a lot of interesting work, but it's perhaps most importantly looking at the national legal frameworks affecting the integration of economic migrants and refugees. This is supporting the policy dialogue that we seek to advance, for example, with the example of Colombia. And there's additional future work planned profiling migrant households and doing analyses of key push factors, also a survey and interviews planned to identify the perceptions that inhibit the reintegration of returnees into the labor force. So I will wrap up here. I know we're short on time, and so I will give back a few minutes to the group. I want to say this has been an excellent, excellent conversation. There are multiple areas in which I think the World Bank can become more involved, and I would love to support that to be a good partner for all of the MIRPS member states in this effort and the organizations that were represented here. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all the panelists for this interesting dialogue. To conclude our event, I would like to invite Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, Ms. Katrina Tapley, to share the conclusion and closing remarks.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Government of Canada, thank you to everyone for taking the time to participate in this MIRPS support platform event. I want to thank also our esteemed colleagues from Honduras as the MIRPS pro tempore president, as well as the UNHCR and the OAS for their insightful opening remarks. We would also like to thank our moderator for guiding today's event and our panelists who have led some thoughtful discussions on challenging the multifaceted issues we're facing. This gathering has heard 3 powerful testimonials today about personal lived experiences. We want to thank our speakers for their words, their resilience, their courage. Their experiences also underscore just how important our work is here and how we can impact lives. Earlier today, Minister Fraser noted the impact of his recent visit to Guatemala. Although today's session was virtual, it gave everyone much to think about, and while these issues are complex, they remain imperative to address. Canada's objective for today's event was to raise visibility of the situation faced by hundreds of thousands of forcibly displaced individuals. We also aim to show the resulting impact on the communities across MIRPS countries and to call for the active engagement of the international community. To this end, we would like to sincerely thank those listeners who have joined us and who present an interest in the issues discussed today. As chair and on behalf of the Government of Canada, we wish to highlight 2 upcoming events planned in 2022. In March, we will hold a multi-day signature event on resettlement, complementary pathways, and integration in Canada with our trusted partners. And at the end of our 10-year, Canada will host a MIRPS support platform solidarity event in the MIRPS region. Canada's solidarity event, predicated on the strong success of our predecessor Spain's 2021 solidarity event, will aim to encourage concrete political, financial, technical, and material commitments to address the needs identified by the MIRPS countries through their collective needs and national action plans. Both events will promote the inclusion of non-state actors, along with other support platform meetings and activities we will be leading. We'd like to close off today's event by extending our appreciation, in particular to the UNHCR and OAS for their vital support, enabling us to host this event and our many other activities ahead. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see many of you again next March.